was in charge of a massive killing machine.
He was responsible for the deaths of 800,000 people. Wiesenthal starts getting on his case.
His plan was to smoke him out.
They were fiercely loyal to the old Germany, to the Reich.
He was an enormous fish for the Germans to bring back.
He had trainees, one of whom was Gustav Wagner.
He was called the Beast.
Simon Wiesenthal is the world's most famous Nazi hunter. In his office at the Jewish Documentation Center, he keeps files on hundreds of fugitive war criminals. It is solitary work. But today brings an unexpected turn.
A drunken man turns up at his office and tells him, if you give me $7,000, I will tell you where to find Franz Stangl.
Stangl was in charge of a massive killing machine responsible for the death of 800,000 people. That's big-time mass murder.
Wiesenthal is intrigued. Franz Stangl is high on his list of wanted war criminals, but he can't help but be suspicious of the unusual offer.
Stangl was a monster, but Wiesenthal wanted to make sure that he had a man that he could trust.
Wiesenthal does a deal with the stranger, but it will only be sealed with Stangl's capture.
He does find out from the man where he's working and his address. Stangl and his family are in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Simon Wiesenthal never sees the mysterious informant again. He's carried a photo of Franz Stangl in his wallet for years. Now, it's time to bring the Nazi to justice.
Franz Stangl was a career policeman. He was an Austrian, and with the arrival of Nazism, he joined the Nazi Party, and he also became a member of the SS.
Then he worked his way up the Nazi Party ranks. Stangl was drafted into a special program in Austria at Hartheim Castle.
He takes part in the T4 program. People who are crippled or mentally handicapped are gassed to death on the grounds that they are Untermenschen, they are inferior beings.
It was a training school for mass murderers. They were carefully groomed.
Can you stand there and watch people being injected? Can you stand there and watch 150 people being gassed in the chamber?
He enjoyed murdering people in Hartheim. He was a passionate believer in Hitler's theories of race and the superiority of the Aryans.
Himmler, who was the head of the SS, personally selected Franz Stangl to supervise this place. He appointed him to that post because he knew that he could handle it. By the time they finished, they had murdered around 30,000 people.
After the war, Franz Stangl found refuge in Brazil. He built a comfortable life for his wife and 3 daughters.
There's a big German community in Sao Paulo. It's like home from home. he's happy.
They got their Wurst and their Wiener Schnitzels. They used to celebrate Hitler's birthday, sing old German drinking songs. They were good neighbors, productive members of the community.
He worked in a car factory. He started to make quite a bit of money.
The war criminal is eventually able to move his family into a spacious new home.
And he finally thinks, that's it. I put the old world, all my crimes behind me. I'll be forgotten.
But Wiesenthal has not forgotten. Like other victims of Nazi cruelty, he cannot forget. He and his wife Silla, also a survivor, lost 89 relatives to the Holocaust.
Anyone who'd gone through the Holocaust, they will never be able to remove that image. Wiesenthal went through it, and he had to keep the cause going.
With a new lead in hand, Wiesenthal reaches out to Brazilian contacts to confirm his target's location. But finding Stangl is just a first step. Bringing him to Europe to face justice is a much more difficult task.
After Wiesenthal's discovery of Stangl, he didn't just want to phone up the Brazilians to try and get the extradition in place, because he knew that things would leak and Stangl would just flee.
To maintain secrecy, Wiesenthal deals only with a network of trusted contacts. He cannot risk alerting the Nazi sympathizers in Brazil.
Every major country in South America had huge pockets of Germans. They were fiercely loyal to the old Germany, to the Reich.
Nazi loyalty could jeopardize Wiesenthal's plan. Franz Stangl may have friends willing to protect him, friends ready to do whatever it takes to stop a famous Nazi hunter. From his Vienna headquarters, Simon Wiesenthal works to set a trap for Nazi war criminal Franz Stangl. He consults government sources and scours historical archives for buried information.
The public had to have one hero keeping the hunt going in the days where everyone was uninterested. And Wiesenthal was that man.
20 years after the war, Wiesenthal is one of the very few people tracking down Nazis.
People were sick and tired of war stories. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal were interested, but I tell you, the rest of the world was not. They were more interested in finding the communist under the bed.
Despite the lack of public interest, Wiesenthal continues the hunt. He digs deeper into Stangl's wartime career, a career which took him from one atrocity to the next.
He impresses his betters at Schloss Hartheim, and Stangl eventually takes part in the next new Nazi extermination program called Operation Reinhard.
Operation Reinhard was the code name for the mass murder of Polish Jews at death camps.
The purpose of a death camp is solely to kill. And there were 3 in eastern Poland: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka.
They were just processing centers for slaughter. And Stangl found himself running these places. You had a hope of surviving Auschwitz. You had no hope of surviving these extermination camps.
Only a handful of people ever escaped. Wiesenthal tracks some of them down. As witnesses to genocide, they expose the inner workings of the Nazi killing operation and Stangl's central role in
the Jews would be packed on trains through the wastelands of that part of Poland. And they'd arrive at this station in the middle of nowhere. And the station would have flowers and a clock and a timetable. If you're a Jew coming off this tortuous, horrid journey from Warsaw, you think maybe there's some normality returning, maybe things aren't too bad. And there would be Franz Stangl.
His job was to be in charge of the processing. He dressed to the nines, white coat and white gloves and perfectly pressed pants and polished shoes.
Behind the station was the scene of utter horror. They were funneled down a tunnel, they were stripped, and then they were gassed, and then they were burnt.
From the whistle to the smoke, 30 minutes.
So you'd be arriving at the station, and before the hour was gone, you'd be dead.
Wiesenthal promises each survivor that he will never stop hunting the former camp commandant until justice is served. Meanwhile, in Germany, an historic trial underscores the urgency of Wiesenthal's mission. 10 former SS men who worked at Treblinka stand accused of war crimes. Stangl is not among them.
He was responsible at Treblinka for the deaths of 800,000 people. But if you look through the war crimes lists, there's no Stangl in there.
He was the chief. He didn't get his hands dirty. He didn't have to go and slit throats.
During the course of the 10-month-long trial, Stangl's crimes, along with those of his former colleagues, are finally exposed to the world. But in Brazil, he remains a free man.
Wiesenthal puts a lot of pressure on the Brazilian authorities to get something done.
Finally, in January 1967, the effort begins to pay off. Brazilian authorities promise to arrest Stangl if Germany sends a formal extradition request. Wiesenthal assists prosecutors by assembling a detailed dossier of Stangl's crimes. In Brazil, Sao Paulo police chief Romeo Tuma lays the groundwork for the Nazis' arrest.
They map out the area and they work out what they need to do. The core of their mission is to stake out the house. And by doing that, they watch his family. They try to work out what time he comes back home.
Unaware of the police surveillance, the threat of arrest is something Stangl thought he'd left far behind. After the war, Stangl spent 2 years in an American POW camp, but the Allies were largely unaware of his horrific crimes.
He's interned by the Americans, but they don't know who he is.
Stangl knows that there's a noose if he doesn't escape.
You like to think that Stangl, had to devise some incredibly cunning means of escaping from the camp, but of course, he basically just walks out.
Security around these internment camps is pretty lax.
So he made his way through Austria down to the Austrian town of Graz, and with another man, decides to use the Catholic Church as their means of escape.
These escape routes were called rat lines, R-A-T, like rats leaving the ship. The most famous rat line was called the Vatican rat line in Rome. And he heard there was an Austrian bishop in Rome by the name of Alois Hudal.
Hudal is at the heart of this Nazi escape network. And Hudal welcomes them and says, "I've been expecting you." Hudal says, "Could you fill out a little CV, a little resume of your career during the war?" funnily enough, you can't find the words either Treblinka or Sobibor on them.
He got immigration cards for Stangl to go to Syria.
From Syria in 1951, Stangl and his family sail for a new life in South America. 16 years later, Stangl's world is about to crumble.
This man was responsible for so much death, was unmolested for so many years.
It's time to get this guy.
February 1967. Sao Paulo police make final preparations for the takedown of former Nazi death camp commandant Franz Stangl. Chief Tuma receives the crucial extradition document that greenlights the mission.
Stangl's picked up just on an ordinary day for him. He's come back from work and he's decided to meet up with his daughter for a beer at a little bar not too far from his house. And he comes back home. Suddenly a squad car turns up. Policemen get out.
There was just no contest. There was no chance of him escaping.
He felt, I'm untouchable.
And they literally bundle Stangl into the back of the car while the daughter is screaming. It's a pretty gut-wrenching thing to watch happening to your father.
Police take Stangl to prison to await extradition. 5,000 miles away in Vienna. What Simon Wiesenthal doesn't know is that Stangl's capture will eventually put him on the trail of another major war criminal. When questioned, the former death camp commandant insists his job was simply to record the victims' names before they were gassed.
One of those banal excuses these Nazi war criminals always gave was, I was just obeying orders.
I'm not going to bow, admit that I did something wrong because I didn't do anything wrong.
He lacked the absolute moral bravery to have to say, look, I think that's a bad thing to do and I want no part of it. Stangl was one of those people without whom Nazism could not have functioned.
Days later, Wiesenthal hears from the mysterious informant. As promised, he honors their agreement. But he never reveals the man's identity.
Some people have suggested that in fact it was Stangl's former son-in-law who had actually shot Stangl to Wiesenthal. The reason why he was suspected, they had rather spectacularly fallen out. He had divorced Stangl's daughter. And he thought, well, I'm going to get my revenge. I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll ring Simon Wiesenthal. The Stangl family to this day are convinced it is that man.
In June 1967, Franz Stangl arrives in Germany to face charges of genocide.
He was an enormous fish for the Germans to bring back.
The Stangl trial was another one of those key moments in Holocaust history, fundamentally, because people hadn't quite realized what had been going on in these camps, and the fact that people like Stangl were still alive, and they had been working anonymous, boring, quiet lives on the other side of the world for so many years.
They don't come with big horns, blood dripping off their fangs. They look like your local cab driver, the local grocer.
On December 22, 1970, Simon Wiesenthal watches from the gallery as the court's verdict comes down. Guilty. For his role in the murder of 900,000 people, Franz Stangl is sentenced to life in prison.
It takes 3 years, according to Wiesenthal, for Stangl eventually to be brought to justice. And of course his family were maintained that he was an innocent man, but of course Stangl was not an innocent man.
Finally, 25 years after the fall of the Nazi regime, Simon Wiesenthal closes the file on Franz Stangl. 4 months later, Stangl agrees to a prison interview with celebrated journalist Gita Sereny. In the interview, he drops a bombshell, one that will put Simon Wiesenthal back in the hunt for another major Nazi criminal.
When he sat down in the prison and was interviewed, he revealed the secret about his past.
He quite happily shopped his old friend Gustav Wagner. And revealed that he too was living over there in Sao Paulo. You know, such is the SS motto, you know, my honor is loyalty. When these guys are caught and the chips are down, they'll shop each other.
At Hartheim Castle Killing Center, Stangl's special skills had made him an excellent teacher.
He had trainees, one of whom was Gustav Wagner.
And gradually the people like Wagner who were introduced into this murder machine were tested. Wagner passed the test.
He was a good student. He enjoyed killing.
One day after giving up his fellow SS officer, Franz Stangl dies of a heart attack.
He lived a good life until he was 63. The guy only spent 1 year in a nice prison in Dusseldorf.
After it's revealed that Wagner is actually in Brazil, Wiesenthal starts getting on his case.
Gustav Wagner was one of the most vindictive, sadistic mass murderers in the world, who just glorified in playing God.
After their posting at Hartheim, both men reported to Sobibor death camp. Stangl was the new commandant, Wagner his deputy. When Stangl was transferred to Treblinka, Sobibor needed a new boss.
And Stangl asked for Wagner. Every camp has this one person that everyone is afraid of, and it was Wagner.
He was called the Beast.
Because the moment he was seen, you knew that someone was going to die.
June 1971. Simon Wiesenthal's new mission is tracking down Nazi war criminal Gustav Wagner in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Wiesenthal knows that Wagner is there, but doesn't know the name under which he's living. And Wiesenthal didn't know where he's living.
His contacts in Brazil find a copy of Wagner's first Brazilian passport, but the address listed is long out of date. New leads prove scarce, but the memory of the Nazi and his crimes never fade for Sobibor survivor Thomas Blatt.
Wagner was a very tall guy. He was huge, he was strong. Seeing him 200 meters away, I was shaking. He was the biggest killer in Sobibor. He was terrible, very sadistic. I was beaten so many times for him.
His greatest trick was to be able to shoot a father and son with one bullet, force the father and son to lean their heads together.
He found a woman who smuggled her baby into a knapsack into the camp. He brought the baby and mother outside, made the mother kneel, and he shot the baby first. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then he shot her.
He had successfully murdered over 200,000 people.
Like his mentor Franz Stangl, Wagner eluded the Allies after the war. He returned home to Austria. He was still there when Stangl came looking for the rat line.
Stangl was walking through there. Suddenly there's a kind of a wolf whistle or a whistle from a building site, and it's, "Hi, Franz." And who is it? It's his old friend Gustav Wagner. And they decide that they're going to try and find a new life overseas.
Both Stangl and Wagner ended up in Brazil. They started off together. They ended up together. They lived about 30 miles apart.
It's almost chilling to reflect upon the fact that when these Nazis were on the run or in their new lives, a lot of them used to be very friendly with each other. Eichmann and Mengele would meet sometimes in the ABC Cafe in Buenos Aires. And with Stangl and Wagner, it was just the same. Once in a while, they would meet up for some drinks, something to eat. One would shudder to think of what they actually discussed.
He just becomes part of the German community in the hills outside Sao Paulo. He marries a local woman who's got children till the woman dies, and he is then left alone.
After Stangl had been arrested and extradited, Wagner even tried to make a move on Mrs. Stangl.
But he failed to win her over. All she offered him was money in return for a promise to leave her alone. Simon Wiesenthal still does not know where Gustav Wagner is hiding. The trail goes cold and stays cold for 7 years. Finally, Wiesenthal stumbles upon a potential new lead, a newspaper article describing a strange celebration at a hotel in Brazil, a birthday party for Hitler. Might a loyal Nazi like Gustav Wagner have been on the guest list? Wiesenthal tracks down the journalists behind the story.
By that time, I was a staff photographer from Jornal do Brasil. And my boss said, well, we have an assignment. Somebody sent to the newspaper anonymous invitation. This is like a Nazi meeting to celebrate Hitler's birthday, but it was all in code. So I said, well, okay, let's go hunt Nazi.
Brito teams up with a reporter from the paper. The reporter's husband offers to drive.
And we drove hours and hours and hours, and we couldn't find a thing, a person, not even a cow. I said, well, let's stop and eat something. So we stopped on the Till Hotel. We all look very German, so nobody would say, oh, they are Brazilian, they are journalists. We went to the restaurant. There was like those knickknacks. And I started looking, and I said, oh my gosh, it's not possible. There was tiny little porcelains, cups and things, and all of them, they had a little swastika. I said, oh my gosh, we are here. And we looked by the window. There was a group of German people dressed in folklore clothes. We went into this area on the back where they were. I tried to put the writer and the husband in an angle that I would look like I was taking their picture, but actually I was focusing the group. When the German group started realizing that we were taking pictures is when we decided to go to the police. It was a scary moment.
By the time the police arrive, the celebration is over. Only a few of the partygoers remain.
I remember the police asking this Nazi for the passport to see if he got in legally. It starts an argument between the police and the owner of the hotel.
The angry hotel guest is defiant. Police decide to search his room.
And I remember the police in his room and opened a bedside table, and there was a gun there, fully loaded, plus a box of munitions. So he was not here for fun. When the police found the gun, the man was out of his mind. The owner of the hotel was screaming. He started running after us. We had that sense that we had a really good story. But we had no idea of the significance of what we were doing.
Brazilian journalists have stumbled upon a bizarre birthday party for Hitler. The extraordinary pictures are shown around the world. Wiesenthal contacts the journal do Brasil and asks for all of Brito's photos. But when he searches through them, Gustav Wagner's face is absent. But Wiesenthal, determined as ever, devises a new plan.
He was afraid that Wagner would get whiff of this thing and run. So he played a game, a kind of game that Wagner himself would play. He sent one of the pictures back to the journalist, and he put Wagner's name under it and Wagner's SS number and said, "Print it."
The Brazilian paper runs a story detailing Wagner's war crimes.
Wiesenthal makes an announcement to the world that one particular man in that photograph is Gustav Wagner, the wanted murderer from Sobibor, and he should be arrested. When Wiesenthal made that statement, he knew it wasn't Wagner, but his plan was to smoke him out.
For Wagner, the article is both worrying and perplexing. His record of war crimes has now been exposed to the world, but the face in the photograph is not his.
There is some discussion among scholars, and a few days later, this German that was identified as Wagner was murdered. Nobody knows by whom.
One theory is that actually the Nazis turned upon themselves, and knowing that Wagner was likely to be brought to justice, he would probably spill the beans on some of them as well. So perhaps it was his fellow Nazis who did him in.
So Wagner got nervous. He figured, if they got this guy, Better to be protected by the police than to be killed. So he turned himself into the police.
The Nazi hunter's ploy has worked perfectly. In police custody, Wagner admits to being at Sobibor, although he denies any involvement in the atrocities. Police can see he's not the Nazi in the pictures. If they can't prove he's a war criminal, he'll walk free in 48 hours. But then, a remarkable coincidence changes everything. A coincidence involving one of the few survivors of Sobibor, Shlomo Smajner.
O senhor Gustav, o senhor é mesmo o homem que foi julgado em Nuremberg e condenado.
One day, Shlomo, who was living in Brazil, was watching evening television. The set flashed a figure of Gustav Wagner. Shlomo exploded. He couldn't believe that he and Wagner were breathing the same air. So he jumped on a plane and he went down to Sao Paulo and he went to the police station.
Authorities now have the perfect opportunity to nail Wagner. Police Chief Tuma arranges a face-to-face meeting between the former victim and his tormentor.
Este homem está dizendo que o senhor era o chefe do campo de concentração.
Não, isso não é verdade. Chefe foi Stangl.
Stangl? Franz Stangl. Agora, chefe, Spitz, era Oberscharführer Gustav Wagner.
Ele fala...
He doesn't dream that in that situation, one of the very few people to survive Sobibor should be in the same city and come up to him.
Vocês matavam, fuzilavam, rebentavam, faziam o que queria e ninguém. Você hoje, depois de 36 anos, seja um pouco de macho, homem.
And he says to Shlomo, you should be grateful to me, I let you live. I mean, that is just the most astonishing admission of guilt.
His identity confirmed, Wagner is now held pending extradition.
Everybody wanted Wagner. Poland wanted him because Sobibor. West Germany wanted him for major war crimes. Israel wanted to hang him.
He knew that he was on a conveyor belt to stand trial and spend the rest of his life in prison, just like Stangl and others had. He was terrified with that prospect.
While he's in custody, Wagner goes seriously over the edge.
Brazilian prisons are not very pleasant places.
Two weeks into his incarceration, Wagner attempts suicide by smashing his reading glasses and eating the broken glass.
The man was never stable to begin with, frankly, and with this enormous pressure, he grows increasingly suicidal. He threatens to subdue himself in.
And he's locked up in a prison hospital in Brasilia.
He attempts suicide twice more, slitting his wrists in a bathtub and bashing his head against a wall. Wagner's fate now rests with the Brazilian Supreme Court.
His life would never be the same again.
It's been 35 years since Gustav Wagner's brutal reign of terror at the Sobibor death camp. The decision to put him on trial for his crimes now rests with Brazilian judges.
The Supreme Court of Brazil, for some technical reason, decided that it would not allow the extradition of Gustav Wagner.
And the Brazilians released Wagner to go back home.
The shocking decision is condemned around the world.
There was no legal reason why they shouldn't extradite Wagner. The evidence against Wagner was just as overwhelming as against Stangl. But there was no real future for him anymore in Brazil. He knew that whatever happened now that he had been exposed, people would hunt him down. Whether it was Wiesenthal or the survivors.
And the next thing we know, he's dead.
He's found with supposedly self-inflicted knife wounds.
His family said he was stabbed in the chest and it was suicide.
Now, there are a lot of people think that actually he was the victim of a murder. It's pretty hard to sort of stab yourself to death in the way he had done. One theory about how Wagner was killed was that maybe it had been a vengeful survivor who had done so, maybe someone who had survived Sobibor, tracked him down, and actually murdered him.
And I interviewed Shlomo, and I asked him about Wagner. And he looked at me with his sly smile, and he said, he committed suicide by stabbing himself in the chest, and he laughed.
I would like to kill him, but I wouldn't do it because I would go to jail. First of all, my family would be ruined. So different things for consideration. If I would be alone, probably I would.
Wagner escaped justice. He should have suffered the trial and suffered long imprisonment. He'd enjoyed many years of happy life in Brazil, which he shouldn't have been allowed to enjoy.
It's a mystery even to this day quite how Wagner met his end, but it was certainly a violent end, and if one believes in a certain sense of biblical, poetic justice, he certainly met it.
Simon Wiesenthal, history's most famous Nazi hunter, claims responsibility for bringing hundreds of Nazis to justice. None are more important than Franz Stangl and Gustav Wagner.
Stangl and Wagner, between them, have 1 million lives on their conscience. It was thanks to him and the pressure that he brought to bear that men like Stangl and Wagner met their fates.
He did come to symbolize the hunt for the Nazi war criminals when everyone else had forgotten it.
In 2004, Britain awards Wiesenthal an honorary knighthood for his extraordinary achievements. Dying in 2005 at the age of 96, he outlived most of the Nazi criminals he hunted.
The satisfaction came from the world now knows.